Hey Siri, show me Walter White at his most masculine.
I would.
Nope.
I am the one who knocks.
Wrong.
Say my name.
Definitely not.
Then decay, then transformation.
Better? That's more like it. I am dead serious. Just so we're clear here, let's make sure we're not conflating the terms masculine and badass. The two are certainly not mutually exclusive, but their Venn diagram is absolutely not a single circle. Walter White, at least in the last 2 seasons of Breaking Bad, is undoubtedly a badass, a phenomenal anti-hero, and quite frankly, one of the best written characters in the history of television. He is also a shining example of failed masculinity. That is, he demonstrates in his behaviors numerous vices that are not true masculinity, but rather a corruption of it. Some might call it toxic masculinity, and while I don't like to use that term because of its ridiculous and frequently inaccurate overuse in modern society, I wouldn't wholly disagree with that label being applied to Mr. White. Speaking of labels, I bet you don't like them being applied to you. That is where this video's sponsor, Delete Me, comes into play, helping you keep your information safe and out of the hands of data brokers who want to sell it. If you don't already know what data brokers are, let me break it down for you real quick. They scrape data about you from a huge variety of sources, including government records and social media, put together a profile, and then offer that up for sale to whomever wants to pay for it. This puts you at risk of threats such as phishing scams, where a bad actor will take information they've bought about you and try to trick you into installing malware on your computer, wiring them money or the like. With Delete Me, I can easily and quickly get my data removed from hundreds of data broker websites. Despite running a YouTube channel, I try to be private about my information online, and yet Delete Me still found brokers with my name, address, past addresses, relatives, and more. Delete Me does this automatically, so I can personally trust them to stay on top of protecting my personal data. You can get 20% off of Delete Me US customer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Samwise and use promo code Samwise at checkout. That is joindeleteme.com/Samwise, code Samwise. Many thanks to Delete Me for helping to keep my data safe and for sponsoring this video. And now, back to Walt. In order to be truly masculine, one must act virtuously. After all, what is masculinity if not the essence of a good man? And what does a man do?
A man provides for his family.
Providing is, of course, a good, a very high good. A man should absolutely be willing to sacrifice for the well-being of his family, and that is exactly what you have right here. I'm not saying that Walter having to deal with bored teenagers who don't even bother trying to grasp the beauty of chemistry and being mocked by the fact that he's doing manual labor is glamorous, or even that it's not embarrassing. My own pride would certainly be wounded in such a scenario. But ultimately, if you look at these scenes through an objective moral lens, Walt is doing absolutely nothing wrong and just about everything right. He is instructing as best he can the youth of his community. He is performing a service to others, and most importantly, he is providing for his family. But not as well as he could be. A large part of Walt's shame is that he knows his potential is far, far beyond his current circumstances. But through at least one poor business decision and some bad luck, this chemistry genius is teaching dull-eyed teenagers and giving out change at a car wash instead. And those feelings of shame aren't to be condemned, at least not in their entirety. Men should absolutely strive to fulfill their potential and push their physical and mental abilities to their limits. It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable. Change that to, say, body and mind, and I would completely agree. Though that quote is commonly attributed to Socrates, so the goal of attaining strength of mind was an obvious and foregone conclusion for him. I'd like to focus in on one of the first words of that saying: shame. This is an emotion that we as humans try extremely hard to avoid, since the existence of it within us is an indication that we have done something wrong, that we are not as we ought to be, and that wounds our pride. Pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. True humility is the only antidote to shame. Shame and pride exist locked in an ever-strengthening cycle where they reinforce each other, and our pride pushes us to do things that are rather stupid, rash, and immature in order to avoid future shame. In Walt, this spiral of vice manifests itself in his compulsive need to be the winner. For so long, Walt had been, as he might see it, kept under another man's boot. But as his journey as a meth cook begins and his agency and control over his life increase, so too does his pride. Most, if not all, of Walt's failings occur due to his hubris, due to his desperate need to preserve his own self-image as a protector and provider. In the very first episode, he hears some random nobodies mocking his son and does this. Walt wants others and himself to know that he's the man of the family, that he will stand up for his son, which would be a good thing if he didn't escalate from verbal jabs to physical violence. Look at how proud of himself he is, and look at how Walter Jr. smiles at him. That's the worst part of it. Walt had the opportunity to teach his son a lesson in humility, accepting your own limitations, affirming that a physical handicap does not make you less of a man, and learning to ignore the worthless opinions of morons. And yet instead he says through his actions, if someone laughs at you, kick him in the knee when he's not looking. Again, badass? Yeah, I guess. It's a little cowardly to be honest, but he does stand up to the guy. But masculine? Absolutely not. A true man knows when to be a badass and when not to. Let's take Iroh, for example. When surrounded by Dai Li agents, he unleashes the Dragon of the West in order to provide for his and Zuko's escape. But when Toph instinctively attacks him, he doesn't let his pride be as bruised as his tailbone is, and instead responds gently and with sympathy, offering the lost, lonely, and scared girl a cup of tea, companionship, and some words of wisdom. Walt's failings as a man occur time and time again due to his inability to properly order his passions and motivations. He wants to provide for his family because, after all,
a man provides for his family.
But he chooses to do so in a way that is grossly immoral, and then he continues to do so because, well, he wants to.
I'm in the empire business.
Failures of masculinity such as Walt happen due to a man taking a trait that would be virtuous if properly ordered and turning it into vice by taking it to extremes. There are given virtues that men often express more noticeably than women do, and those are the ones that are often seized by men who act as Walt does. Take, for example, the virtue of courage. A man can fail in two ways when it comes to this virtue. He can either be a coward, letting fear control him, not acting when he ought to act, or he can be foolhardy and rash, plunging himself into dangerous situations that suggests he's really quite terrible at risk-benefit analysis. Both of these are failures of masculinity, but since courage is seen more as a masculine virtue, that is, its expression by men is done in more noticeable ways, we are far quicker to denounce as unmanly cowards than we would be madcaps who walk into a room full of armed drug dealers holding a bomb. But Walt was effective. He got what he wanted. He won. Yes, that's kind of the point. Walt's goal was not remotely virtuous. Evil ends cannot be attained through good means. And of course, good ends can ultimately not be attained through evil means. Whoever does evil in the supposed service of good will become evil himself. At least in the beginning, Walt's intentions were not totally impure. He wanted to provide for his family to ensure that they were taken care of after he was gone. There's no real sense that he's doing this to leave a legacy, or even so he'll be remembered fondly. He simply wants to not leave his wife and children destitute. Hence his calculation of the exact dollar amount needed before he can stop cooking meth.
$737,000, that's what I need.
From the very beginning, Walt was planning for his death. His diagnosis with lung cancer, his conversion with Jesse about Jesse's aunt who suffered the same illness, and his uneducated guess at the scary-looking glowy bit on his CT scan led him to believe that his end was not far off, which gave him an out. Walt could cook and sell his meth, provide his family with enough to live on, and then shuffle off this mortal coil, knowing he wasn't leaving Skylar drowning in debt and unpayable bills. This tells the audience that Walt was not yet fully corrupted. He was not yet
In the empire business.
There was still something decent within him, something that wanted to be done with the evil in which he was partaking, and he had a plan to that end. Which, of course, gets turned upside down when Walt discovers that he is, in fact, in remission, and that his tumor has shrunk far beyond expectations. Side note, Walt's assumption that he was about to die happened because Marie made a comment about her being able to easily read the scan results. It's not just a special doctor thing.
I could take one look at Walt's and tell you immediately how he's doing.
And clearly, Walt thinks himself way smarter than Marie, so he assumes he could do the same thing, because, he's kinda arrogant. Anyhow, with his death suddenly not weeks, but instead probably years away, Walt's plans are ruined.
Just when I tried to get out, they pulled me back in.
Hence, this scene. This is what pride does when it doesn't get its way. It causes us to lash out and act quite irrationally. This scene is remarkably effective in portraying Walt's pride in a manner quite different than most other scenes in the series. The audience observes Walt acting out of sheer unadulterated hubris time and time again, often in more obvious fashion, like when he trashes Jesse's meth just because he's spiteful and possessive. But in this bathroom scene, we see how simply having his plans altered causes Walt to blow a gasket. Pride is not flexible. It does not easily deal with snags and twists in its designs. And when those designs get upended, Walt becomes rather lost. Which lasts a good long while. The first 5 whole episodes of the 3rd season are spent without Walt so much as picking up a beaker. He's out of the game. He's trying to get his family back after his second cell phone faux pas. He's trying to not be the bad guy.
I accept who I am. I'm the bad guy.
I am not a criminal.
Again, Walt sees himself as superior to Jesse, to Marie, to whomever. He does not want to be Jesse. That is, of course, until Jesse makes the mistake of showing him the meth he cooked. Ah, poor Jesse. He just wants some approval from the man who tutored him in the ways of blue rock candy, but of course none is forthcoming because Walt is feeling rather possessive. No small wonder there, since Skylar recently, well...
I fucked Ted.
Not that equating a wife and a meth formula is the right thing to do, but the feeling of loss that has been churning within Walt since he learned of his wife's affair most certainly affects his reaction to seeing Jesse stealing his product. This is yet another manifestation of pride. The prideful man believes that he is the source of good, that what he has created is due to his own effort and belongs to him and him alone. He refuses to acknowledge that he stands on the shoulders of giants, and in order to prop up his own image, he heedlessly tears down others.
Now, this is very shoddy work, Pinkman. I'm actually embarrassed for you.
This is perhaps the most fascinating part of the character writing of Walter White. His chief vice is pride, and one might think that a character so dominated by one singular sin would be rather one-dimensional, and yet he's not, in part because his pride manifests itself in so many different ways, as we've already discussed and will continue to cover as we progress through Walt's story. As you may remember, the insult to Walt's ego caused by Jesse daring to cook the master's formula drove him to return to Gus, arrogantly tell him that he sees through his little manipulative games, but then ultimately to hear his offer once again, this time with a little more philosophy behind it.
What does a man do, Walter? A man provides for his family.
According to Gus, a man provides no matter what, even if he is not appreciated, respected, or loved by those for whom he provides.
He simply bears up, and he does it because he's a man.
The best lies are often not the opposite of the truth. They are instead truths taken and twisted to fit our own selfish needs. Gus is right, a man should provide, but what should a man provide? Food, housing, safety? Absolutely. Comfort, enjoyment if possible, but are those ultimate goods? Are they to be chosen above respect and love? Should a man pay to provide for his family with his very soul? I think not. A man should provide for his wife and children, yes, but above all, he should provide them with himself. He must be a servant leader, an example of virtue to his kids, and a bastion of strength and love for his wife. He must be a man worthy of their love. One of the most tragic scenes in Breaking Bad follows closely on the heels of Gus's "a man provides" speech, as Skylar is beginning to believe that Walt might just be such a man once again. That is, a man worthy of respect and love.
You want to take her?
Despite knowing what Walt did, despite her severely damaged trust in him, and despite her lawyer telling her the idea that Walt did what he did for the sake of the family was
one enormous load of horseshit,
Skylar now supposes that he has changed, that he has set aside his past mistakes, that he can be trusted to be a father. Not knowing that Walt has already made the decision that will ultimately tear their family apart for good, she thinks the man she is watching soothe their infant daughter is a changed man. And she's right, just not about the direction of his change.
You wanted me out. I'm out, but I will provide for my family.
But she didn't want you out, Walt. She wanted you back. Your son wanted you back too. The relationship between Walt and Walter Jr. doesn't receive nearly as much focus as many of the other relationships in the show, but it has one particularly poignant scene that occurs after Walt and Jesse demonstrate what I can only describe as the least masculine martial art known to man. In his pained state, Walt makes the rather poor decision to mix painkillers and alcohol and ends up rather loopy and weepy when his son comes over.
I'm sorry.
It's not Walt's finest moment, but really Breaking Bad as a show could be summed up as a collection of Walt's not finest moments. But in this moment, Walt fails in the opposite direction than he has been. Just a few episodes earlier, we were treated to one of the best known monologues from the show, and perhaps the one where Walt's hubris reaches its peak.
Let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger.
Those lines were, of course, utter nonsense, as Walt was very much in danger of getting offed and was almost completely powerless, but that's pride for you. Now, instead of puffing up his chest like a silverback in mating season, Walt cries and moans about how it's all his fault, how he's made so many mistakes.
It's coming.
Not a great image to project to your son. Not that there's anything wrong with being vulnerable and honest with your children, but a man should have a little more control of himself. And when he wakes up, Walt realizes that his behavior the night before was less than ideal, and goes to apologize to his son. Except what he really wants is to ensure that Walter Jr. has the quote-unquote right mental image of his father.
You really can't think of me like...
Walt, because he's Walt, then goes on to tell a rather lengthy anecdote about how the only real memory he has of his own father is from when he visited him on his deathbed, and people, pretty famously, do not look so great when they're about to die.
But the only thing I could remember is him breathing, this rattling sound, like if you were shaking an empty spray paint can. I don't want you to think of me the way I was last night.
And this is just pure, unadulterated pride. The need to control how people remember you is absurdly narcissistic. Walt wants it all. He wants to be the provider and to be remembered as such. He needs his son to know him as a strong, capable man who kept him fed, clothed, and housed, even though it cost him everything else. In that, Walt goes beyond Gus's expressed provider philosophy. He doesn't really accept that he can be a provider and not be respected by his family, even in death. Which is absurd, because who cares what people say about you after you die? A man shouldn't worry about the legacy that he leaves behind. That's foolishness. Thinking about such things is a complete waste of time and energy. Energy that would be better spent striving to love one's family as they ought to be loved. Your legacy, your true legacy, is your chosen course of action, not what people think of you. You could be the most virtuous man in the world, and some people would still hate you, perhaps even your own family members. So be it. What matters is not what they think of you. What matters is that you loved them as best you could. And that is ultimately Walt's failure. He chooses pride over love. He chooses himself over others.
I'm in the empire business.
That is to say, I want as much power as I can get my hands on. I want control over how people think and speak of me. I want to die knowing that I will be remembered long after my death, even in ignominy. At least he admits as much before the end.
I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it.
There's not much else I feel the need to say about Walt in Season 5. By the time he uses Hector to blow up Gus at the end of Season 4, Walt is pretty much already gone full villain mode. Sure, he descends further into the hole that he dug himself, always grasping for more money, power, and renown no matter how he can get them, but he was already too far down to pull himself back up. At least from a storytelling perspective, dramatic changes of heart and redemption are certainly possible, but sudden and unexplained ones don't come across super well in a TV show, especially when your story is about how a man's hubris destroyed everything of value in his life. And while there are 1,000 other examples of Walt's arrogance that one could examine, for example, him thinking he could kill Gus by knocking on the man's front door with a revolver in hand,
Go home, Walter.
him getting pissed off when Skylar has him express regret over his fake gambling,
Weak. I'm out of control. I mean, this whole thing makes me look like crap.
him moving back into the house and calling Skylar's bluff with the police.
I haven't been the most attentive husband lately.
It's hardly necessary to list them all. I think I've painted a pretty full picture of the man's failings. Walter White was, eventually, very good at being a badass, but he was terrible at being a man. Masculinity does not mean being confident, forceful, and aggressive without condition or restraint. It means knowing how to properly order such traits. It means providing an example of selfless love to the next generation, not because you want to be remembered fondly, but because you want your children to grow up to be better than you were. It means putting others before yourself, providing, protecting, and guiding for their sake, not for the sake of your own image. In all these things, Walt failed. his story is still one that really matters. Clearly not because of his character arc being uplifting or inspiring, but rather because it explores a darker part of the human psyche. It sheds light on the pride that exists within all of us, that drives us to act as we ought not to act day in and day out. It doesn't so much make us look up and say, I aspire to be like him, but rather to look down and think, yeah, I'd better get my act together. If you somehow haven't seen Breaking Bad yet, I apologize for spoiling lots of it. Not all of it. I left out quite a few big moments. But also, you should watch it. If you've already watched it, you should watch it again. There is so much depth to the characters, to the point that when I watch a few scenes, I get the urge to write a mini essay just on the characterization presented in those 5 to 10 minutes of story. I didn't because this video would end up being multiple hours long, and that's just not necessary. In fact, this video has gone on long enough as it